This lecture presumes that you've completed the laboratory on age-specific survival, but this chart is a little different from what we had in lab. The tables we plotted from in lab have the number of survivors, or really the log number of survivors, in the column that we would be plotting. Here, in the second column, I'm giving you the survival rate. If this were a type 2 species, the numbers would be the same all the way down. Here, you've got peak survival in the middle ages of 2 and 3 years, and lower survivals both earlier and later. Newborns, or young of the year, survive that first year of life at a rate of 40%. 1-year-olds survive at a rate of 60%, 2 and 3-year-olds survive at 80%, 4-year-olds start to feel the weight of senescence and survive at 60%, and for our intents and purposes, we'll say that anybody older than 5 years old is not important enough to figure into our demographic analysis. And so we put their effective survival at 0. And this makes for a total of 6 age classes to consider in our demographic profile. So, if there are 54-year-olds in the population this year, how many of them will become 5-year-olds 1 year from now? So looking at this table, you'd say that the survival rate of 4-year-olds is 0.6 or 60%. And so of the 50, I expect 30 still to be around next year. Okay, so how many of these 30 will still be around 2 years from now? Well, the survival rate of 5-year-olds is 0, and so the answer is none. See how this works? If we plot out numbers starting with 100 young of the year, the number of survivors making their way through the ranges of ages declines until at age 6 there are none left. And plotting a proper age-specific survival chart with a log transform number of survivors, the plot looks like this. There's another super important column in this demographic table, and it's age-specific fecundity, which is another way of saying fertility or birth rate. Basically, this says how many new babies do we expect to be born this year per individual in the age class being considered. For the young of the year age class, it's 0 because newborns generally don't make babies while they're still babies themselves. There may be no babies produced in the second year as well. Fecundity of the 1-year-old age class is also 0. Reproductive maturity starts in the 3rd year of life, and so 2-year-olds average 2 babies per individual. Then for 3 and 4-year-olds, reproduction peaks with 6 babies per individual per year. Then, as 5-year-olds, they're going to be dying off at a pretty high rate, and so the production of new babies won't be so great. It's down to 2. This is another example of a population level characteristic, right? If we were talking about bunny rabbits here, you wouldn't be able to get this information from observations on a single bunny rabbit. But if you have enough observations from a sufficiently large number of bunnies, you'd be able to work out estimates for these numbers in the same way that you estimated age-specific survival patterns in our laboratory exercise. So how can these numbers, the age-specific survival rates and age-specific fecundity rates, be of use to us? Well, I'm glad you asked. At a purely utilitarian level, this is precisely the information that we need in order to project population demographics into the future, or at least for as long as the age-specific survival and fecundity rates remain the same. And this is incredibly useful for us for things like planning. For example, by using basically the same type of information, we can predict enrollment patterns at Maricosta College for 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And this allows us to plan our allocation of resources. If the demographic projections indicate an increasing number of high school seniors needing a local place for a college education, it would make sense for us to invest in hiring faculty, building more classrooms, etc. But if the outlook showed little growth, no growth, or even negative growth, it would make more sense for us to use our resources in a different way. Another application of this type of demographic projection is in the actuary sciences. That's the number crunching done by insurance companies to balance projected future payouts to policyholders against what they take in as premiums. If you offered life insurance policies with low premiums to a demographic with a high likelihood of death, you'd go bankrupt in a hurry. You need to know the expected likelihood of death for any prospective customer and then take a right-sized bet against having to pay out. Our interest in age-specific survival and age-specific fecundity has to do with how these numbers correspond with two things: a population's demographic profile, or age structure, and a population's growth rate, and in particular, how specific mutational changes to age-specific fecundity will affect the population growth rate. Let's start by demonstrating how you could use these numbers in this table to project the demographics for a population. This column of numbers under t equals 0 represents the age structure or demographic profile of our population at time t equals 0. Each number gives how many individuals there are in the population in the age class shown at the left. We are starting with a population that has 10 individuals in each of the 6 age classes. It really doesn't matter where you start. That's actually one of my points here. In a relatively short time, the population reaches a stable age structure with the same proportion in each age class from one time to the next. So let's see what our population will look like next year. We know the survival rates, so 10 young of the year individuals have a survival rate of 0.4, so next year there should be 4 one-year-olds. The 10 one-year-olds from this year survive at 0.6, so there will be 6 two-year-olds. The 10 two-year-olds from this year survive at 0.8, so next year there will be 8, and so on. Boom, we're done. T equals 2 years from now. We can get there by projecting again, presuming age-specific survival rates stay the same. The 4 one-year-olds survive at 0.6, so there will be 2.4, rounded 2. 2-year-olds in year 2. The 6 2-year-olds will survive at 0.8, so 4.8, round to 5, and boom. My rounding to whole numbers here is okay because we're not looking for precise projections, and a little error is not going to affect the general outcome. 3 years from now, boom, 4 and 5. And so 5 years from now, we have 1 survivor left out of the 10 young of the year that we have today. And yes, we do need to fill in the tops of the columns. And this is the part that requires the age-specific fecundities. We're going to sum together all of the babies produced by all of the individuals in the fecund age classes. The 10 2-year-olds in year 0 produce 2 babies each for a total of 20. The 10 3-year-olds produce a total of 60 babies, another 60 from the 4-year-olds, and the 10 5-year-olds contribute 20 babies for a total of 160 young of the year in year 1, t equal 1. Then in year 2, 40% of them, or 64, will still be around now as 1-year-olds. And of those 64, 60% of them will survive to be 2-year-olds in year 3. That looks like 38.4, round to 38. And finish that for that cohort. Now we'll do the same thing to get young of the year for year 2. 6 times 2 is 12 from the 2-year-olds, plus 8 times 6 is 48, plus 8 times 6 is 48 again, plus 6 times 2, 12, 12 plus 48 plus 48 plus 12 is 120 total young of the year in year 2. And their projected survival for the rest of our demographic projection looks like this. Now, do the same thing for year 3, year 4, year 5, and we have projected the demographics of our population for a period of 5 years worth of change. So that covers my objective here, to show you how age-specific data are used to project demographics. But there's more. You can see that this population is starting to take a more consistent shape, in which a relatively consistent proportion of the population is young of the year. A consistent proportion is 1 year old, a consistent proportion is 2 year old, and so on. This is one of the outcomes of applying age-specific survival and fecundity rates. There's a stable age structure that's reached, and it doesn't really matter what the starting frequencies are. I started the population out at 10 in each age class, but I could have started out with 100 3-year-olds and none of the other age classes. The age structure we end up with constant proportions of young of the year, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds is the same as what we got here. Now I found an online calculator that would continue on with the projections, but for full disclosure, I had to scale back my fecundities to 40% of what they are in the table in the upper left. So in other words, instead of 2 babies for 2 and 5-year-olds, it's 0.8. And instead of 6 babies for the 3 and 4-year-olds, it's 2.4. I had to do this because when I used the actual numbers that are in my table, the population size after 100 years was so huge and the scale had to be compressed so much that it really didn't give us a good picture. And I needed something that I could use for topics that I want to talk about later. For now, though, let's spend a few more moments on the concept of a stable age structure. Now, if you've taken a class in economics, you'll have heard of this, that national populations have demographic profiles, the age pyramids, that are reflective of both the national population's growth rate as well as predictable economic pressures. Here we have the age pyramid for Egypt in 2005. This is basically a two-sided histogram in which the bars go sideways, with the males on one side, usually left, and the females on the right. The bars going from the bottom upwards correspond to older age classes. The bottommost bar here, left and right, would correspond to boys left and girls right in the 0 to 4 age class. The next bar up would reflect the number of boys and girls in the 5 to 9 year age class, 10 to 14, and so forth. It's called a pyramid because of the shape that it often takes, especially for a growing population. High birth rates, large numbers of kids per family, results in a youth-dominated population. With the passage of 10 years, the little kids of today will have entered into the teens age class, and they will have been replaced by an even larger number of little kids. This type of wide-bottomed age pyramid indicates a rapidly growing population. And this is exactly what we see with the population that we have projected. Same graphic here as before, but I've added the proportions at the stable age structure. About 49% of the population is in the youngest age class, about 19% in the second age class, 11% in the third, and declining further from there. Keep in mind that these results are what I got having scaled back the fecundities to 40%. With the actual numbers seen at the table in the upper left, the base of the pyramid would be even broader and the growth rate faster. I hope from this you can see yet another connection between what we do in BIO202 and some of the other classes or fields of study that you might at some point be engaging in. In this case, the age structure as applied to national populations has very real significance both in economics and political science. Now, more directly relevant to our current biological discussion, we can now say that we have a mechanistic understanding of how life history population descriptors like age-specific survival and age-specific fecundity are directly related to population growth. The numbers in this table basically dictate how fast or slow the population will be growing. What we're looking at here is exponential growth, the same equation that we use for exponential decline of type 2 survivorship curves, except that here the lambda value, the multiplier that we use to get from population size at time t to the population size at time t plus 1, remember this equation? The lambda value was less than 1 in the case of exponential decline. In the introductory video for the Life History Evolution Lab, I used a survival rate, that is, lambda, equal to 40%. Now, if lambda is greater than 1, then the population size at t plus 1 is larger than the population size at time t by a factor of lambda. And as the population gets larger, the rate of increase also gets proportionally larger. And the result is an accelerating increase in population size, exactly what we're seeing here. Now, in the second lecture of the semester, I usually mention Thomas Malthus as an influence on the young Charles Darwin. Malthus basically pointed out to the world that exponential growth is a thing, and that since the power of populations to increase is indefinitely greater than the power of the earth to provide sustenance for, say, the human population, we were on a road that would inevitably take us to growth beyond what could be supported. Disease and famine, shortages of food. He didn't say anything about toilet paper. These would all ensue. And this is commonly referred to as the Malthusian catastrophe. Malthus published his essay on the principle of population in the year 1798, 14 years before Darwin was born. But the gist of his argument was still resonating with Darwin when he reasoned that the power of the population also applied to all living forms. And therefore, there would be no shortage of death and destruction, as required by natural selection for winnowing out the best variations in the process of adaptation. So in a lot of ways, Thomas Malthus is the father of exponential functions, and the general shape of exponential growth is a J-shaped sort of plot. We're going to plot out some actual numbers to demonstrate. I usually do this in class with students running the calculations along the way, but hell, that's not going to happen here. So I'm going to go with Google Sheets. It will save us some time in this video, but you should repeat this on your own as a reinforcing exercise. Let's start with the population size n sub 0, which is the population size at time t equals 0 of 100 individuals. Lambda will be 1.6. I picked this number arbitrarily. Basically, any value greater than 1 would give us the same basic shape. At time t equals 1, the population size n sub 1 will be n sub 0 times 1.6, or 160. At time t equals 2, the population size n sub 2 would be n sub 1, or 160, times 1.6, or 256. Note that this is also n sub 0 times lambda squared, and the general function for exponential growth could also be expressed as n sub t is equal to n sub 0 times lambda raised to the tth power. Both of these are equally valid mathematical expressions of exponential growth. One tells us how to calculate population size based on how large the population was at the previous time interval. The other tells us how to calculate population size at some time relative to a fixed reference, here n sub 0. Now we're going to generate a third expression for exponential growth that will be consistent with the way that it's presented in your textbook, but it requires a bit of notation coming from calculus. In a typical semester of BIO202, I'll have some students who've already been through or at least started their calculus sequence, and others who have yet to get that far. This lesson serves both to reassure the first group that what they learned in the math class is actually useful for a biologist. At the same time, it gives some reason for the second group of students to look forward with great eagerness to a math class that they will soon be enjoying. So before getting to the derivatives, let's start by taking the natural log of both sides of this exponential growth equation. It will be the natural log of n sub t is equal to the natural log of n sub 0 plus, because that's what you do when you're talking about exponents of a set base, plus the natural log of lambda raised to the tth power. And you should know that the second term simplifies to t times the natural log of lambda. This part is just basic algebra. And now we're going to do a substitution. We define little r as equal to the natural log of lambda, and we replace the natural log of lambda with this new term in our equation. And so we have the natural log of n sub t is equal to the natural log of n sub 0 plus rt. Now we can go directly to the calculus step. Take the derivative of both sides with respect to time. d dt of the natural log of nt is equal to d dt of the natural log of n sub 0 plus d dt of rt. So at this point, anyone who has had the calculus lessons breaks into a big ass grin because this is something they can totally do. The derivative of the natural log of n sub t is 1 over n sub t times the derivative of n sub t, dnt dt. The derivative of the natural log of n sub 0 is 0 because n sub 0 is a constant, and the derivative of a constant is 0. And the derivative of rt is just r, and so our equation depicting exponential growth has become 1 over n sub t dn sub t dt is equal to r. Multiplying both sides by n sub t, the rate of change of the population size, that's population growth rate, dn dt, is equal to the population size n times r. There's no need for that subscript anymore because the n sub 0 term has disappeared from the equation. And the subscript was really necessary only as long as we were looking at a time relative to a reference point of t equals 0. Little r is the per capita rate of growth of the population, and it basically tells you how fast the population will accelerate towards infinity if left to grow without constraint. Little r is sometimes referred to as the Malthusian parameter, after Thomas Malthus, of course, but in textbooks, it's usually identified as the intrinsic rate of growth, how the population would be growing if it were allowed to grow without any density-dependent factors that would cause it not to grow as fast. We'll get to that later. Okay, but now here's the Darwinian part. Anytime you have a population that's growing exponentially, there's going to be strong selection favoring any mutation that causes little r to have a higher value. Even a tiny difference in little r is going to be strongly favored. And this is because of how even a minute change in little r results in a big difference in growth. Let's take our population with lambda equal to 1.6. If we bump lambda up to 1.62, after 1 year, the difference in growth rate would only be 1.25% greater, pretty small. But after 24 years, the population growing with lambda equals 1.62 would have a 35% advantage, much more substantial. That means that if a mutation caused the intrinsic growth rate to be 1.25% higher than everyone else's, in 24 years, that gene's actual fitness advantage would be 35% and only growing greater over time. You can project out the relative advantage at any point in the future using the old exponential growth function. If the advantage per year is 1.62 relative to 1.60, after 100 years, the cumulative advantage would be 1.62 raised to the 100th relative to 1.60 raised to the 100th, which, if you run the calculation, is 340%. The way that even small advantages compound over time into huge advantages means that selection will be strong for any change resulting in a higher value of little r. Basically, this means that under these conditions, and keep in mind we're talking about conditions allowing for exponential growth, anything you change that will make little r even a little bit bigger will be strongly favored by natural selection. But what kind of change results in an increased value of little r? I'm glad you asked. Here's where we go back to the life history table. And yes, if fecundity rates increase, you will have an increase in little r. Here, I've changed the number of babies in years 3 and 4 from 6 to 6.2. The effect of this change after 100 years is about 180% advantage in numerical increase, as shown here. And remember, I had to scale back the fecundities for this graph to 40% of the values that are actually shown in the table. But still, that's pretty dramatic. Okay, so now let's check out what happens if we leave the total number of lifetime babies the same, but nudge them forward in time, so that there's one more baby produced as a 2-year-old and one less baby as a 5-year-old. The effect of earlier reproduction is much more dramatic than the increase in lifetime reproduction that we were looking at before. After 100 generations, the advantage is nearly fourfold, 400%. You can think about many ways for explaining why this happens. The generation time, and thus the doubling time, is shorter. The number of 2-year-olds that are positively affected by this is greater than the number of 5-year-olds that's negatively affected. But the point that I want to stress is that under conditions of exponential growth, selection favors higher fecundity, and even more so, it favors earlier reproduction. Here's where the trade-offs we introduced at the end of the lab come in. Remember, you have limited resources for survival and reproduction, and so you can't increase reproduction without sacrificing some ability to maintain your body for peak survival. And so, if selection causes you to reproduce earlier and more often, an expectable downside of this will be a shorter lifespan. Two other really obvious things that are likely to change under this type of selection are: one, the size of the individual offspring, and two, the body size of adults. Again, constraints result in a trade-off. Now, given that a female is going to allocate X amount of resources to reproduction, she still has leeway into how that allocation is going to be spent. Specifically, she can increase offspring number, but that will mean that the size of the offspring would have to decrease. Alternatively, she can opt for bigger offspring, but that's going to mean that she'll have to make fewer of them. Now, if you have selection putting a premium on little r, as in the scenario that we're thinking about here, clearly you want to go with offspring number, and consequently, you might expect the offspring size to be smaller than what you would expect if exponential growth conditions were not driving the evolution of these life history traits. I want you to note that it's not that selection is favoring small babies. Other things being equal, larger babies would still be better for fitness. But in this case, other things are not equal, and there's a strong premium on producing lots of babies. And so fitness decreases caused by having smaller babies is just collateral damage. Now think about adult body size. Typically, animals will have a pre-reproductive period. Basically, you put all of your resources towards growth and survival until you reach sexual maturity, after which body growth slows dramatically, if not stopping entirely. In our exponential growth scenario, the benefit of reproducing earlier may have an even greater positive impact on little r than increasing fecundity. Reaching sexual maturity at an incrementally younger age would have the effect of bumping up the value for little r. But that's also going to mean less time growing as a pre-reproductive, and thus body size at adulthood is going to be smaller. Again, it's not that selection is favoring smaller bodies, but under conditions driven by exponential growth, there's a strong selective premium on reproducing early, and whatever fitness decrease comes from having a smaller body size is, again, collateral damage. Now think about this. If life under conditions of exponential growth were driving the evolution of a population, you would expect that evolution would take the direction towards shorter lifespans, smaller babies, and also smaller adults. This actually has a name. We call it r-selection, and the organisms with these life history traits are called r-strategists. But there is an elephant in the room. Very appropriate, given that elephants are clearly not r-strategists. When, if ever, is exponential growth going to last for long enough to drive the evolution of life history traits? Wasn't it a lesson from both Malthus and Darwin that population growth cannot continue exponentially without limit? If exponential growth of anything, naked mole rats, were actually allowed to continue unchecked, we would be miles deep under the bodies of naked mole rats in a matter of years. Populations are always going to be subject to limits and declines. But the question here is, to what degree is the growth rate of the population tuned to the limits that are set by the reality of the world? And here's where we get to the difference between density dependence versus density independence. In density dependent ecologies, the population growth rate is strongly affected by population density. As populations increase in size, the growth rate slows, stops, and even reverses into the negative range as the result of constraints imposed by the environment. Basically, the environment tells the population, okay, that's enough, you need to stop growing now, and the population obeys and stops its growth. But not all species do that. Density independence means that the population basically ignores the environment. Environment says, it's time to stop, you're out of food, and the population keeps on growing, oftentimes leading to a cataclysmic population crash, putting the population to very low numbers from which exponential growth starts all over again. This gives us what we sometimes refer to as a boom and bust population cycle, which really isn't a cycle at all, or at least not a regular one. And yes, this is a real thing. Lemmings and locusts are just a couple of examples of animals that famously reproduce themselves into numbers that far outstrip the available food. And in the case of locusts, this results in ravenous swarms of insects that destroy everything in their path. Now, if you look at the boom and bust history, most of the time these species are under conditions of exponential growth, except for that one period in which the populations crash because of their insane numbers. The population is increasing more or less exponentially. These density independent species are exactly the ones where you would expect our selection to drive the evolution of the life history traits of our strategists. So lemmings, locusts, short lifespans, check. Small offspring size, check. Small adults, yep. It's not just locusts and lemmings either. The same argument applies to nearly all agricultural pests, including insects, weeds, and even microbes, including bacteria. Our strategists tend to be really good at colonizing vacant habitat, and that's what you have with a freshly plowed field or a large amount of food plants growing in a concentrated area. Boom and bust species, colonizer species, including crop pests, are all fitting both in their density independent ecologies as well as their r-strategist life history traits. The lesson we're developing here is that ecology is a very important driver of evolution, at least in the case of species with density independent population dynamics, that is, exponential growth. Our selected species are pretty easy to spot when you see them. Their short lives, small bodies, and large numbers of small offspring have been shaped by natural selection favoring little r. The next thing we're going to do is to address the other kind of ecology, density dependence, and I'll save that for the next video.